All right, good evening, everybody. Thanks you for joining. Those of you who are here earlier today, thank you for coming next door. For those of you who are just joining us now, welcome to Meridian. And for those of you tuning in online from wherever you are, on your couch around the world, welcome and thank you for tuning in. I'm Frank Justice. I serve as a vice president here at Meridian. I oversee our open diplomacy programs. I'm also the director of our Space Diplomacy Initiative. Meridian International Center is a nonpartisan institution dedicated to advancing diplomacy. We were founded in 1960, and we've been working to advance international collaboration and cooperation for the past 65 years, right out of this historic campus here in Washington, D.C. We have three institutional pillars. The first is to maintain our alliances. The second is to strengthen strategic competition. And the third is to build geopolitical resilience. And this gets to our open diplomacy framework, which is the idea that it can't just be the diplomat, the public sector official alone that advances the international affairs of a nation. We need our mayors and our governors. We need our athletes and our artists, our business leaders, our scientists, our technologists, and our astronauts to play a role in advancing the foreign policy of our nation. And so at Meridian, we work to provide these non-state actors with the knowledge, the resources, and the relationships to be successful on the international stage. This program is part of our Space Diplomacy Initiative, which is part of our larger Center for Technology, Innovation, and Space. At its core, the initiative is focused on 4 areas. The first is to preserve American leadership in the space sector through international cooperation and partnership. The second is to advance international norms for government and industry. And so, Duncan, thanks to you and the crew, we're certainly doing that this week. The third is to democratize space for pre-emerging and emerging spacefaring nations. And then the last area is to accelerate the global space economy for the U.S. and our ally nations. At Meridian, we are increasingly focused on exploring the best avenues for nations to partner with the U.S. on space, as well as identifying and overcoming the barriers to this cooperation. We do this through Track 1.5 dialogues, such as hosting the first ever commercial session for the US-EU Space Dialogue, which we held back in earlier this fall, which brought some of you, but many from the US commercial space sector, together with the European Commission, and really a first initial discussion around the EU Space Act. At Meridian, we also engage in professional exchanges. And so last month, we partnered with the US Department of State to bring space leaders from Bahrain, Oman, and Egypt to Washington, D.C. and Texas to explore avenues for partnership with American academic institutions and our commercial sector. We also do our work through cross-sectoral convening. Next Thursday, on December 11th, that's next week, we're going to be hosting the 5th anniversary of the Artemis Accords. So it was officially 5 years old back in October, but we're going to celebrate with some of the original authors of the Accords. Yes, Mike Gold is among that, and he's helping to orchestrate this gathering. We're going to have over 10 speakers, including leaders from the U.S. government and foreign government officials, and they're going to discuss the origin, the status, and the future of this set of non-binding space norms. Finally, our space diplomacy efforts are accomplished through training and creation of guides and other materials that can be used by space leaders to advance space cooperation and international engagement. This includes a guide we are currently creating to support nations in their efforts to partner with the U.S. on space. We have a special program lined up for you this evening. I'm excited to explore how popular science, speculative fiction, and futurist thinking can inform the development of norms and governance in this increasingly complex space domain. Before we dive in, I have a few housekeeping items. First, please note there is no idling in this residential neighborhood. If you are so fortunate to have a driver, please text your driver now and make sure that they are parked in our lot, which is at the end of the semicircle here. Tonight's program is on the record, open to press, and as I mentioned, it is being live streamed. We'll have a copy of it or a recording of it available on our website soon. I stopped giving a time frame because our comms team said, stop doing that. This evening's program and reception are part of the Track 1.5 Dialogue on Emerging Space Norms, being held in partnership with the PLUS Alliance, a global partnership which combines the strengths of 3 leading research universities on 3 continents to solve global challenges. We know that is ASU, King's College London, and University of New South Wales. This program is being supported both by the PLUS Alliance and through the Ahern Family Donor Advised Fund at the University of Notre Dame, who supports Meridian space diplomacy efforts in the spirit of Major General Joseph A. Andrews, a decorated civil engineer who served in the U.S. Air Force. And with that, it's my pleasure to welcome to the podium one of the key organizers of this program, Duncan Blake. Duncan, over to you.
Thank you very much, and it's very, very much a pleasure to be here. I have the pleasure of leading this together with my co-leads, Mark Hilborn from King's College London and Diana Bowman from Arizona State University. But this is not so much about that. It's about a fantastic evening about imagining the orbits, the fictional futures, and the realities of space governance. So welcome to what I'm sure will be a really interesting conversation about the power of imagination to shape not just stories, but the future of humanity's activities beyond Earth. Let me put it in the context of our broader Track 1.5 dialogue about emerging space norms. In this Track 1.5 dialogue, we're bringing together people from across government, industry, academia, civil society to talk openly, off the record, about the importance of normalisation in the space domain. That might be an unfamiliar term. We more often talk about laws and regulation, but space is a very dynamic domain, and activity and the proliferation of actors are significantly outpacing legal and regulatory frameworks. And in current geopolitical circumstances, the prospects of new instruments to keep pace with space activity is small to non-existent. Meanwhile, there are expectations and behaviours that are not legally binding and yet can still compel compliance. These norms are taking shape in space right now. The participants have been imagining how that might happen and how we might take a more intentional, coordinated, multi-sector, multidisciplinary approach to this normalisation. And imagination is the key. As Einstein famously said, imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited, imagination encircles the world. That simple insight captures something fundamental, I think. While facts and data give us a foundation, imagination expands our horizons. It allows us to envisage worlds we haven't yet touched, societies we haven't yet built, and futures we haven't yet lived. Throughout history, imagination has been the seed from which great real-world events have sprung. Think of Jules Verne, whose futuristic novels foretold submarines, moon voyages, and space travel, and how those speculative visions helped inspire a generation of early rocketry and space pioneers. People like Robert Goddard, Sergei Korolev, and Wernher von Braun. Although, if you know something of those names, then you'll know that the inspiration is not necessarily all good. Nevertheless, the technical genius of those pioneers, together with their willingness to imagine what was once inconceivable, unlocked the path toward the moon, orbits, and beyond. Yet for all its power, the serious job of imagining remains underrated. We often privilege hard data over audacious dreams, even when it is those dreams that chart our course forward. Our panellists are in the business of imagining. not just the good, but the bad and the in-between. Each of our panelists brings a uniquely important perspective. So I'll mention them and I'll ask you to step up to the stage and hold the applause until the end. So first of all, Ray Nayler, a Hugo and Locus winning speculative fiction and a author and a Foreign Service officer, reminds us that imagination isn't escapism, but a tool for empathy, global thinking, and envisaging futures where different intelligent societies and ecosystems coexist. Dr. Erika Nesvold calls us to confront the ethical challenges of living beyond Earth, urging us to imagine not just technology and colonisation, but justice, equity, and responsibility in the cosmos. Erika is the author of Off-Earth Ethical Questions and Quandaries for Living in Outer Space. Dr. Kelly Weinersmith is a Hugo Award and 2024 Royal Society Trivedi Book Prize writer and author of A City on Mars. Her writing bridges science, ecology, and speculative possibility, reminding us that imagining life on worlds like Mars isn't just science fiction, but serious thinking about human health, society, and survival in a radically different environment. Our moderator for this evening's panel is Che Bolden. Che is the CEO of the Charles F. Bolden Group and chair of the Inter Astra Institute, and he shows us that imagination, whether in business, policy, or social equity, must include access, inclusion, and leadership for all, especially as space becomes a new frontier of opportunity. So please join me in welcoming our panellists to the stage. You can find each of their full impressive biographies in your program books. And with that, I hand over to you, Che.
I appreciate that. Thank you all for allowing us to spend some time with you this evening. I hope what we are able to do here in the next 45 minutes or so is have a conversation that is participatory and fun. As you will notice, I think that the four of us present a little bit differently than you all, so hopefully that's a key to what we're going to get into. For those of you who are not familiar, I'm the son of space, so to speak. I grew up in the shadow of the space shuttle. I grew up in Houston, Texas, at the time where shuttle was this big thing, and it was the next best time in space beyond Apollo, as far as I think we understand. And I grew up remembering almost verbatim a speech from 1962, long before I was born. And by my assessment, that is the last time someone has been able to articulate a message that was able to catalyze and push societies forward into something that they were not necessarily ready to believe in. And that, to me, kind of epitomizes the value of storytelling and the value of the narrative around these massive achievements we try to go out and do. And what we're finding today is space is not a destination anymore as much as it is a gateway. It's a way for us to create new value, both on the business side down here on Earth, but also in deep space, when you start talking about how do we expand the human condition out into the stars. And so as we start to talk about how we can affect people's perspectives on that, the very first thing we've got to be able to do is learn how to communicate with one another. For those of you who don't know who Nicole Mann is, United States Marine, was the commander on the ISS. I was at an event with her a couple of months ago, and she reminded me of something I learned very, very early on. It's like when you have teams or when you have a community, there are two things that have to be resident before anything else can happen. One is you have to speak the same language. You have to understand what each other are saying. And the second one is you have to be operating from the same expectation of what you're trying to do. And if you don't have those two right, you're never, ever, ever going to get there. And so with our panelists here, they have mastered, and I will say that, the art of storytelling and the ability to take an idea, put it into a narrative to get people to feel and to decide to act on that. Before we get into what each of you are looking to the future for, I just want you all to kind of provide a very short, succinct manner. Why are you here? What is your purpose?
Oh boy, we're starting philosophical. My purpose, I guess, in life, so my husband and I should note that my husband wrote the book too, is to communicate complicated, nuanced ideas in ways that are fun. And so, for example, when we told our editor, she asked, how many chapters on how international law relates to space are going to be in your book? We said 5. And she said, you guys better be funny. And so we got away with 5 chapters in the book. And so anyway, we try to convince people that, even you don't think you're interested in this nuanced, complicated topic, but we're going to tell you stories and tell you jokes to get you through it because we think it's important. And so that's my mission in life, to get people through complicated stuff by making them laugh.
Ray, when you wake up in the morning, what is your goal?
When I wake up in the morning, what is my goal? My goal is to get my 6-year-old off to school without having any conflict over the breakfast table. No, I like that you brought up communication because I think the core of my first book was a question, which is I'd seen all these first contact stories, and I kept thinking, how could it be that easy to talk to an alien species if we can't even talk to each other most of the time? Like, you can't even have a conversation around a dinner table anymore. How are you supposed to talk to something that looks like an octopus, right? And writes and has a language that wraps around, and all these things. So, and I set out in my first book to address the difficulty of communication, and I think that's something that I confront every day.
Erika?
Speaking of communication, I think that all of the work I've done in all my various fields came out of me pursuing my own curiosity, and then once I found some answers or some interesting questions, sharing them with other people. And that's true of my work as an astrophysicist. I work partially in science communication now, but in terms of my space ethics work, I consider myself sort of filling a similar niche as a science communicator, but for these questions at the overlap of our future in space and ethics and social justice.
So you all got to this point out of thin air. That's not actually how it happened. So each of you has an origin story that really kind of plays into why you've come to believe that you can make a difference telling stories. Ray, your life has taken you across cultures, conflicts, political systems. As a Foreign Service officer, you've got experiences that a lot of us in this room might be familiar with, but not completely. Which lived experiences most changed how you understand power, cooperation, and most importantly, human behavior, and how does it show up in your stories?
When I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Turkmenistan, this was 2003 to 2005, it was really interesting. Everyone had gold teeth, and especially like young mothers had gold teeth, and it was strange, right? Because how is it that someone in their 20s ends up with like a full set of gold teeth? And I asked someone, like a scientist in Turkmenistan about it, and he said the reason people have gold teeth is because of the Aral Sea drying up. And I thought, how could that be? Well, it turns out that the reason people had gold teeth, right, is because the Soviet Union built these canals to irrigate the desert, which then led to the rivers not reaching the Aral Sea, led to the Aral Sea drying up, and all of the pollutants that were on the bottom of the Aral Sea turning into dust, blowing around, bonding with people's iron receptors so that they were anemic, and then that anemia and vitamin deficiency in pregnancy causes tooth decay. And so you end up with a lot of women having to replace their teeth, and since gold teeth are the style, that's how you end up there. And this made me just appreciate how there are these enormous systems behind everything, these connections, and how do you express those things except in these really complex ways, because these are really complex reasons for the existence of things. So that's...
Wow. So speaking of complex things, Erika, as you move from pure astrophysics, into asking those ethical questions about how society should behave in space, what moment or influence pushed you towards seeing science and ethics as inseparable?
I have a pretty clear point in my history story I often tell here, which is that I had a fantastic opportunity while I was working as a postdoc at the Carnegie Institute here in DC to go out to Silicon Valley to do some work with a program for planetary defense, defending the Earth from asteroids. And they made a point to introduce us to a lot of people in the private space industry out there, and this was exciting. I was thinking about leaving academia. I was thinking about going into the field into the private space industry. And this was 2016, so space mining was all the rage at the time, and I had a lot of conversations with entrepreneurs who were working on space mining companies. And I asked them questions that I'd been thinking about for a while because I had a lot of early childhood exposure to science fiction. And so I asked things like, how will you prevent environmental contamination of the moon from your mining equipment? How will you protect the labor rights of people working in space? And I don't like to say that they were dismissive of these questions, but they just weren't interested in answering them. They said, we'll worry about that later. And I sensed that that was wrong, but I also recognized that the people I was talking to had the same kind of background, training, expertise that I did, which is that we're all STEM-trained people who focus more on the technological problems, the financial business case problems, and assume that we can figure out the rest from first principles when we get to it. And so that was the moment where I went, well, this doesn't seem like something we should put off, but nobody working on these problems right now has the right background. And I came back from that trip and started talking to people like colonial historians, like philosophers and activists in various fields to see what lessons we could learn from our history and present here on Earth and apply to space. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, which is something physicists and engineers tend to want to try to do all the time.
So, has anybody in the audience heard of a book called The Fuzzy and the Techie? Anybody? So it's by a gentleman named Scott Hartley, and it kind of gets to the point of what Erika's talking about, and it leads me to my question for you is, when you bring together a bunch of different skills into a story, and what you and your husband have been able to do is take science plus humor plus curiosity, blend them all together, that has opened up doors for some more technically minded people to think about something in a less technical way. What early experience drew you toward using that playfulness, that alternative approach to explore how serious scientific questions can be answered?
Gosh, that's a great question. So I think partly it was I've tried explaining things to like my students or to my children or to my friends that were kind of complicated things that I was reading about because I'm a pretty boring person, and what I mostly want to talk to people about is what I spent all day reading about. And so I would try explaining it, and I could see people's eyes glazing over, and I was like, I gotta find a way to get a joke in here, or I gotta find I gotta read about the history, like what else was happening at the time that these experiments were happening that I could use to like make this experiment more interesting, and basically just like add some flavor to this story. And I noticed that people's eyes glazed over less while I was talking if I threw some jokes in there. And so I could get people to listen to what I thought was interesting if I was able to throw some jokes in there or tell some stories also. And so I think mostly I was just trying to get people to not fall asleep while I was talking. And it worked. And also while I was teaching, I wanted to make my students pay more attention, on days when they were maybe less interested in the topic.
As a recovering crayon eater, I find simple stories are the best ones. As you talk about that, for all three of you, how has storytelling, fictional or scientific, become your way of making complex space issues feel human and accessible? And before you answer that, I want to ask, does anybody out there know what Eli 5 is? You want to explain Eli 5? Yes. I just learned that, and everything has to be explained to me. I learned the only way I can actually understand something as a Marine is it's got to be explained as if I'm a fifth grader. So how do you all do that? How do you bring these complex things into something that people are willing to read, not just for professional development, but for entertainment?
Well, Ray's a science fiction author.
So Paul Virilio said, when you invent the ship, you invent the shipwreck. Every technology carries its negativity with it, right? But I think that the more interesting thing is when you invent the ship, you invent the shipwreck. But when you invent the shipwreck, you invent the Odyssey. And all of the storytelling that goes around shipwrecks and all of this nuance and detail. And you open up these whole new worlds, these whole new affordances. Once you can have shipwrecks, you can have marooning on desert islands, and you can have all these other things. You get the Tempest, right? You get all of these things. And I think what's interesting about storytelling is you can focus on these little tiny parts of a question that kind of illuminate the whole. Like when I think about Mars, I think once people have lived on Mars for several generations, will the teenagers find the ruins of the first settlements to be retro? Like will they, explore them looking for interesting objects, right? Like what will the trash of those previous generations look like? What will their equivalent of an abandoned gas station on the side of the road be? Those kinds of questions, I think, pull people into a universe rather than just answering something for them.
Is it a fair question that you all got into storytelling because you weren't hearing things that made sense to you, and you wanted to explain it, or you wanted it to be explained in a way that made sense to you, or what was the motivation for transitioning from a science base, a teaching base, to a I'm going to tell story base?
My goal with my book was, which is nonfiction, but includes, at the beginning of each chapter, it includes a little science fiction vignette. And my goal was mostly that I didn't have jokes or illustrations, but I wanted people to pay attention. And in particular, I wanted them to identify with these hypothetical future space settlers I was talking about. Because, as I'm sure in your work, many of you know, when people look at the big picture, they look at the numbers, it's hard to get them to focus on the individual experience of people. And my book was based on a podcast I had made, and in my podcast, I blatantly ripped off a format from another podcast called Flash Forward, where the producer started each episode with a little fictional vignette about the technology that they were going to discuss. And so that way I can have a chapter about how will we build a criminal justice system in a space settlement, but it starts with, okay, you're living in a space settlement and someone has stolen your space boots. What do you, or you've been accused of this. And that helps people connect emotionally to the topic, and which, as it turns out, changes their opinion on how we should be building communities in space compared to the more high-minded, ideological, data-based approach.
Yes, I'll be honest, nothing about my life ever goes the way I think it's going to go. And so when we started writing A City on Mars, we had just finished writing this book about emerging technologies, where we interviewed folks at like Deep Space Industries about asteroid mining, and we had interviewed folks about the rapidly falling cost about launching mass to space. And everyone we had talked to was telling us this story about how the only thing that's been holding us back from settling space is that it's so expensive. We know everything we need to know to settle space. We just need to be able to send the habitat modules to space, but we can't afford to do that. And my husband and I were like, well, that's awesome. Space settlements would be so cool. We didn't know it was just about money. And they're all telling us that we're going to be able to do it now because it's affordable. And now we don't even have to worry about shipping water up because we can just get it from the asteroids. And so we pitched that book to our editor. And our editor was like, sounds a little naive. Are you guys sure you guys aren't getting played? And we're like, no, it's a bunch of people told us this. And we were like, okay. But so then we dove in, and 2 years later, Deep Space Industries wasn't Deep Space Industries anymore. Planetary Resources wasn't Planetary Resources anymore. And it turns out that there's a lot of problems beyond expense. There's a lot that we don't know about how human bodies respond to space, blah, blah, blah. And so the story that emerged was all of the complications. And so we wanted to tell the more nuanced story, like what do we know about how human bodies respond to space? And we thought all of the nuances were really interesting, like, how the bones break down, but is there some point where your bones stop breaking down? I don't know. Anyway, we thought all the nuances were interesting. That's what we wanted to get across. But it wasn't the story we thought we were going to tell initially. Sometimes you find the story on the journey.
Right. So one of the things that storytelling to me has been able to uncover, and you kind of hit on it, and I think even things that are perceived as nonfiction kind of share the same story, is it requires you to find more information about the topic at hand. My favorite movie of all time is Interstellar. And one of the things I use, and I'm not going to get this fact completely right, but through the production of Interstellar, they created a new model that scientists actually continue to use to this day. Does anybody know what I'm talking about there? Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And they did that for creativity's sake, and it ended up becoming one of the most accurate depictions of what we know about black holes. And so Interstellar talked about the future, so we'll transition ourselves to that future and to the world we see moving ahead, and how you see your storytelling, fiction, nonfiction, shaping that. Ray, when you imagine what comes next for humanity in space, what tensions keep returning in your stories, and what do they reveal about our readiness as a society, or unreadiness to govern ourselves beyond a place where we can draw borders, i.e. Earth?
Well, I guess one of the things that worries me is that we continually apply old metaphors to new experiences. And I have this feeling that we're treating space like we treated the ocean. And we did an extremely poor job with the way that we treated the ocean. And we're reaping the results of that very, very poor job, the garbage islands of plastic and all the piracy and the massive amounts of human slavery occurring right now all over the global ocean because it is virtually ungoverned and unpoliced. And so I really think that we need to think very clearly about the metaphors that we employ. And I think that we talked about space as, right, a frontier and this vast sort of void. And that sense of desert or void or emptiness of something always seems to invite the same human reaction, which is, well, if it's just empty, we can do whatever we want with it. And then once we start doing whatever we want with it, that becomes the path that we're going down. And we're already seeing in low Earth orbit the results of that kind of behavior. So this is my fear, that we will treat space the way we treated the Mojave Desert when we ran tanks all over it and destroyed the soil, right? We will be doing things like what we did in Nevada with atomic bomb testing that will treat it like the ocean. And what I would like us to do instead is maybe to go a little slower and think of what other more productive metaphors we could use. One thing that came to me when I was invited to this panel is like, maybe stop talking about space because it makes it sound like one thing. But like orbits around planet Earth is an extremely different thing from interstellar space or a journey to Mars or all of these other things. So our language kind of lacks these good descriptive popular terms for parts of space, right? And so I think we have this feeling to like kind of generalize about space, which I think is dangerous.
So Eric, as we look forward, when we discuss space, outposts, settlements, colonies, whatever words we decide to use, what ethical pressure points do we know today as we project forward and you tell stories of the future? What ethical pressure points do you see as the ones most likely to shape our successes?
Well, I use the approach that Ray just described to identify where these, to try to predict where these pressure points might be, which is to look at the metaphors that we're using, which often when you're talking to entrepreneurs, trying to get investors and whatnot, are presented as good metaphors. It'll be like the gold rush, it'll be like the transcontinental railroad, it'll be like the colonization of North America, all of which, of course, were very complex and led to a lot of harms. And so looking at what were the ethical pressure points historically? What are the pressure points we experience today with, as you mentioned, labor rights in an isolated environment like out on the ocean? What can those stories tell us about the challenges that we'll run into in space, both in the near term and the far term, and even today? A lot of people, when I talk about my work, expect me to be talking about some future point, whether that's 5 years from now or generations from now. But of course, there's issues, as you mentioned, with environmental harms of resource exploitation that's happening in an empty, intangible resource right now, which is low Earth orbit. There's issues with labor rights on Earth in the space industry. And so looking for these parallels, looking for these metaphors are usually where I focus. And I just named the two that I talk about the most probably, which is environmental justice and labor rights.
So, Kelly, as you explore those realities of a life on Mars, or building new habitats just in microgravity and beyond, what mix of wonder and skepticism guide your sense of which futures are actually possible for us as humans?
Oh, wow. I think it's really hard to decide, to know how things are going to pan out right now, because it really depends on what path we end up taking. So for example, you can really imagine things going differently if the first settlement is a company town, for example, or if the first settlement is a commune, or if the first settlement is an international research station. And I think right now it's hard to know what the first settlement is going to be like, because I think we're so far away from the first settlement. And so I like to see people having conversations about what it could be like and how we could make sure it could be done well. So one of the things I would love to see people doing more is talking about, like, well, if it's going to be a company town, what did we get right about company towns, and what did we get wrong about company towns? Because we got a lot wrong about company towns, and there's lessons about what we got wrong about company towns, and there's scholars who have studied what we got right about communes, and there's lots of communes that had the same problems. And basically, I'd just like to see folks who are thinking about settlements in the future talking to scholars who have looked at these things on Earth. And I'm sure we're going to have different problems in space, but there's so much we could learn from these scholars on Earth so that when we project into our future in space, we can avoid a lot of the sort of ethical things we could predict, like the sorts of problems we could predict, because we've experienced them here on Earth.
So I'm going to ask one more question I think is a short answer for each of them while you all think about your questions, because we're at that point now where we get the fun part, which is you all ask and they answer. While they're thinking about this, one of the things that gets to me all the time when we talk about creating narratives and storytelling is the languages we choose. And I'm not talking specific about English versus Spanish versus French versus Quebecois or whatever else. I'm talking about Artemis, Athena, Apollo. Why is the Greek and Latin language synonymous with space?
Because it comes from academics in the Western sciences who come from the tradition of Latin and Greek, meaning that you're educated.
What questions do we have out there? Yes, sir.
So glad that we're hearing about all these ideas feel super important for everyone that we're talking about and considering. And if we were still living in Pax America, and if we were still living in Pax Americana, it would be exciting, but kind of not. So I want to understand how you guys think about, I guess, the geopolitical moment and how that also shapes the stories and how we think about things. I do want to keep this at a slow pace. What are the other costs that everyone in the world having this conversation?
Well, I've written 3 books, and I've never set a book in the United States, and I've never had an American main character. And in most of my books, America's only mentioned 1 or 2 times, because I precisely think that there's this problem that we have in science fiction, and that problem is that we keep imagining it from certain places, right? And we keep imagining scientists as certain kinds of people who come from certain countries. And I guess my argument was always like, how is science fiction supposed to talk about the entire universe if we can't even talk about all of humankind, first of all, right? And so I think there's opportunities in that space out when you look outside, right? And end of Pax Americana, all those things are way above my pay grade, as we would say. But like, I really do want to reimagine some kind of place for everyone, at least to start thinking about other things. Like when you start thinking about space, I'd like to start thinking from the entirety of humanity and the human condition rather than just New York, Los Angeles, London, right, and Paris, which seem to be where the aliens usually live.
Always, every time, every
Right?
time, every time. For the non-Americans in the room, answer this question as candidly as you possibly can, internally or out loud if you want. When you think about a culture associated with space, what do you think about? France, I love that one. Okay, yeah. Well, I don't mean to highlight, something that gets under a lot of people's skin is until the culture of space is seen as something that's more inclusive, you're going to continue to have these problems. And this is where stories, narrative come in. And I think that's the part, I think, if we really, focus on what this panel itself was supposed to do, it leads into what you all are doing here at Meridian. You talked about all these different perspectives and where it's written from. You're bringing mayors, not just from U.S. cities and towns, but from all over the world, have these conversations. And those perspectives are going to be important. Yes, ma'am.
All right, I think it works. Thank you so much. So my question is kind of flipping the image, right? It's talking about imagination as a tool of policy. And I feel like often we're kind of prisoners to the limits of our imagination in terms of what is possible. So I wonder if you can maybe, all of you, speak to how we as policymakers, researchers, all of us, can be more imaginative in what we think is possible, and what is the role maybe of fiction and nonfiction in helping us kind of go beyond the immediate, which I think is a very dangerous way to think about things, especially in tense geopolitical environments. So.
Do you want to start that one?
Yeah, I will say that this motivates a lot of my work, actually, in writing about space settlement. I completely agree with Kelly and Zach that space settlement, especially sustainable human space settlement, is not going to happen in our lifetimes. So why do I bother writing books? And I co-founded a nonprofit. Why do I spend all my time talking about it? And it's because of something I discovered as I was working, writing, and speaking about these topics, which is that you can, by setting these policy conversations, these questions about how we want to build our societies together, by setting it in the science fiction type location, the context of a space settlement, it gives people this psychological flexibility to imagine much more radical solutions to how they want to build society than they could ever imagine here on Earth today. I mentioned criminal justice before. It's something I discovered when working on criminal justice. People, Americans, are much more likely to think about how they would build a non-carceral society, a non-carceral criminal justice system from scratch, and that's much easier for them than to imagine how we would get there from here in the US. And so just imagining it in space, the answer's not quite that easy, but I think that sort of thought experiment of what if we were starting from scratch. It doesn't solve your problems because we're not starting from scratch here on Earth, but it does help people reach that level of imagination. And that's what's so great about stories.
So one thing I kind of want to lay, I'm sorry, did you?
I was just going to say that's a great answer.
Okay, yeah, great answer.
Yeah.
One
You
thing
gave
I
great
want to
answer,
kind
but
of
Tempest
lay
answer was
flat
great.
about how we tell stories of the future. We've heard the term fiction and nonfiction, science fiction. Anything in the future technically is fiction, right? So can we just talk about the future? As you write about the future and you think about those things, bringing people kind of back together, the question kind of made me think about that common perspective and how we get the culture to be a little bit broader. How would you, let's start with you, Kelly, how would you tell a story that appeals to more people than just what we have here in Washington, D.C. or the DMV or North America?
One thing that I try to do is that when we write a book or we write a chapter, we try to reach out to a very diverse community and ask them in what ways did this story not connect with you? And how did we write this in a way that didn't include you? And so, I'm a white person born in New Jersey. Like, what about this made you feel like it didn't include you? And so when we write, we try to send it to a lot of people. And when we wrote the space law chapter, we tried to reach out to a bunch of lawyers from all over the world to ask.
So you're doing real-time A/B testing as you're writing your book.
Yeah.
Cool.
And so, because I only have my perspective, and so that's my best answer as a nonfiction writer, to try to make it appeal to lots of people, is to send it to lots of people. And we included a disclaimer at the beginning of the book, like, we're white people from America. We tried to include a lot of different viewpoints. We did our best. Write us if we didn't. Let us know where we failed.
I like to start with thought experiments. Like, when I think about the colonization of space, a thought experiment that I've been fascinated with lately is, what if Victorians colonized space? And now we had to deal with Victorians, like, on the moon and Mars. Is that good? Like, is that what we would want? Like, 19th century imperialism, being the form of Mars? So that's us. Like, we haven't fixed a lot of the things that are wrong with us. And I think that we're actually at a very low level in many ways of cultural development right now. And what we need to be thinking is, do we really want a future in which people are like, oh my God, if only Mars hadn't been colonized by 21st century people, right? If only we'd waited and done this when we had thought things through and our culture was in a better space. Like, really, it's kind of asking questions like that. You can ask a question like that in fiction, I think a lot more easier in some ways, or in creative nonfiction, which I think is what both of you are writing as well, a lot easier than maybe some other formats, right?
Anyone else out there? Yes, ma'am.
Hi. I think for a lot of people, space does still feel like science fiction, and it feels really far removed. But I think we're probably all aware in this room the role that space has on our everyday lives. But how do we use storytelling, or how do we bring people into space? How do we bring them along the journey? How do we build social license for future space activity or for current space activity? It can be controversial, or maybe that's just us. How do we deal with that? What role do stories have, and how do we approach that? And it kind of relates to this idea of bringing everybody in and bringing in those perspectives. But when people are trying to put food on the table, they're probably not thinking about colonies on Mars. And how do we make them think about it?
Sorry, just really quickly, the question?
How do we use storytelling to make space more relatable when it does really feel like science fiction?
Gotcha.
So at the end of the book, we tried to bring home the point that along the way to preparing for settlements in space, there's a lot of important questions that we're going to have to answer. So for example, if we're going to be sending women to get pregnant and give birth on Mars, we really need to understand a lot more about women's health, and we need to be way better at supporting women to make sure that this can happen in a safe way in space. So for example, oxytocin is shelf stable for about 3 years, but only if you have it at, I think, negative 20 degrees Celsius, and it has to stay stable. Women in sub-Saharan Africa often will bleed to death and hemorrhage after giving birth. And there was a study that found that we think that it's because in a lot of cases, the oxytocin that they received didn't stay shelf stable the whole time. And so if you're going to be sending oxytocin to Mars, which is 2 years round trip, you need to be able to have oxytocin that's going to stay at a stable temperature so that you can keep women alive. Wouldn't it be great if you just had shelf stable oxytocin at room temperature? So maybe there's things that we could, new medicines we could come up with that would benefit women on Mars that would be great for women to have here. So I just try to highlight the things that we would learn about the human body, or the things we would learn along the way that could benefit people here on Earth and could help people all across the Earth. And so that's how I try to pitch the importance of working towards settlements on Mars for people who would never go there.
Along those lines, this doesn't directly answer your question, but I often speak with space entrepreneurs, including at a retreat that Che invited me to a couple years ago, where someone at some point will say, how do we get people to care about space, about our work? And what I often end up saying to them is, you're going about this backwards. You're looking for ways to get people excited about the space work that you're doing. You need to go out and figure out what those people care about, whether it's bleeding to death from childbirth, whether it's predicting droughts and knowing when to plant their crops, and then figure out how our work in space can benefit that. And sometimes, oftentimes we already know that answer, and the answer to your question is figure out what they care about and then explain how our space work helps to benefit that. Sometimes for space entrepreneurs, in my opinion, it means they're working on the wrong problem, and they need to go figure out what people actually want space for. But I see that backwards view a lot, because I think a lot of people working in the space industry or in space science fields are doing it because they get excited at the idea of space, and they assume that emotion is universal. And that's not the case. People care about different things, but all of them care about something.
What is one idea from your work independently that leaders, particularly in this room, should consider now if we want cooperation, sustainability, and fairness to guide the path into space? What do you want them to focus on?
I will speak again, since my colleagues look like they're thinking. One thing that in my work I've tried to learn from climate change activists and my fellow scientists who work on climate change is, because I think it's a very similar problem. It's something that affects all of us. There's a private, public element to it. It's a very difficult challenge. I'm kind of waiting for the climate change people to figure it out, and then we'll just use their solution for space. But one thing I've learned from climate change activists is that it's not enough to just be a doomer and tell them what's going to go wrong and how we're all going to die, because it turns out that does not psychologically motivate people to action. You have to give them a positive vision of the future to work towards. And so I think that everyone working on space, whether that's space security or policy or entrepreneurs or scientists, need to figure out what's the positive vision that you have or that you want people to have, and what's the path towards that, instead of just here's all the things that could go wrong.
You bring up a very good point about the purpose of the story and the purpose of what we're doing. And I think You bring up so what Erika's referring to, the Interastra Institute has put on, in a couple of years, we've done this thing called the Interastra Retreat. It's a not for attribution salon-style gathering where we talk about challenges to the business of space from the lens in which people come. And one of the things we got to was how do you get this motivation out there? And I think that the thing we kind of coalesced around that the climate folks have jacked up and that the space folks are equally jacking up is we tell people that we're doing it for the wrong reason, right? We send this doomsday message that we've got to save the Earth. Well, last I checked, the Earth's been around a lot longer than humankind, so we're really not going to do that much damage to it. It'll just get rid of us. Have you all thought about let me kind of rephrase this from a different angle. When we talk about AI, which I'm sure you all have talked about at some point today and you will tomorrow, there's this inherent fear that it's going to enslave us and do bad things. I, as a man of color in the United States of America, kind of wonder, why do we think that? Well, I know why we think it's because that's what we think. That's what we do to people. So when you all try and take our way of thinking today and put it in your stories, how do you move people from the conventional way of thinking about things as they are to the way you want them to go? What's a trick that you do to move them in that direction?
So, all right, so the problem is I'm a massive wet blanket, right? So I start my book by essentially saying all of the beautiful reasons you've heard about going to space are kind of silly. Like, it's not gonna save us from a catastrophe on Earth. Like, even if we got 1 million people to Mars, if Earth died, you know, the people on Mars would die a few years later because for a long time they're going to need computer chips from us. If we do it, we should just do it because it sounds awesome, but we need to do it carefully because otherwise, you know, there could be a scramble for territory, and now we've increased geopolitical conflict back here on Earth. I see some people giving me stinky faces. I'm sorry. I know I'm kind of a wet blanket. I'm not fun. I don't get invited to as many space parties as I used to get invited to. And so I don't think I have a great answer for you. I'm just kind of, I'm not necessarily trying to convince people to go do this.
Well, what constitutes a wet blanket?
Telling people the overview effect doesn't have good supports when you look at the data, stuff like that. It doesn't.
Had I known that, why would we be on the same panel? Anyway, I'm
well,
joking.
I know. Sometimes I wonder why I get invited. But,
that,
but I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
No, you bring up a great point. I mean, when there's prevailing ideas out there that you don't agree with, and you all have the ability, because you've got the power of the pen, how do you address those?
I think of everything as this. I mean, I think of everything via systems thinking and this kind of and cybernetics anyway, because I grew up in Silicon Valley and come from a family of engineers who are interested in these things. But here's what I think. I have a theory. And my theory is that the Soviet Union could never have put humans on the moon and brought them back alive. That it was completely impossible because the Soviet Union failed to build the kind of society that was capable of doing that particular thing. Not the kind of society that's capable of putting rockets in space or orbiting or all of those things or putting objects on the moon or any of that stuff, but the kind of society that was capable of caring enough about human life to have the 1,000 upon 1,000 open arguments between engineers that it took to actually solve all of the problems that Apollo would face by the time they got to the surface of the moon. And so what I would suggest to readers, the hopeful thing is, if you build the right kind of society on Earth, you will build the kind of society that can solve all of the problems that you need to solve to do what you want to do in space. But if you fail to build that society, physics and really good mathematicians will not get you there.
You're more
They'll
fun.
get you into orbit, but they're not going to solve all the problems that get the Apollo astronauts back home.
So I was on a trip recently and I got an opportunity to go and watch an autonomous F1 race. Pretty cool. And one would think, it's like, okay, autonomy's coming to take one of the most human endeavors, driving a vehicle around a track endlessly, and made it into this thing that you can do with autonomy. But one of the things I realized is, you know, the doomsday of the jobs are going away is there's only one job that's going away, and it actually created 5 jobs in order to do it, and that's the driver. When you watch the teams that did these F1 races, they were just as involved, just as vital to the execution of that race as it was when the other F1 that's going to happen here in Abu Dhabi in like a week. It creates new opportunities. So when we talk about moving people from where they are right now in society and their general beliefs, culture is going to play a big factor in that. Before we get into, I'm going to close out with some rapid fire questions. My last question, unless anyone else has any other ones, is how do you think we collectively in a governance and a policy space can use narrative better?
I think we could be using it to explore a greater range of possibilities for how we could be starting settlements and governing settlements, and we could be exploring our possibilities.
Yeah, I think we could be leaning a little bit further into the results of things before they happen. And one way to do that is through, imagining the future a little bit better. And I think that's one thing that narrative can do. I mean, someone should have been able to imagine, for example, that if people put chips in their brains to help them see, that if that company went bankrupt, those people were going to be forced to go to the internet to try to get spare parts so they could continue to see, right? This is like a horrible dystopian and real problem. And if someone had legislated for it 10 years out, it wouldn't have happened.
I'll be contrary and say that narrative can be dangerous in this context, because if we just stick with one narrative based on a flawed view of history, we'll end up just repeating the same mistakes we've made before. And so I would advocate for gathering as many different narratives as we can from as many different types of storytellers as we can about what the future in space might look like, instead of just depending on a dominant narrative.
So has anybody ever watched the Actors Studio, Inside the Actors Studio? And anybody know who's the comedian who does the guy on the show? Will Ferrell. So I'm going to do the Renee interview at the end here. Rapid fire, super quick. Each one of you answer as they come. You ready?
Okay.
Star Trek or Star Wars?
Wars.
Wars.
Trick.
What word do you return to when imagining the future of humanity in space?
Dicey. Sorry.
Take your
Pass,
time.
go to a friend.
Take your time, take your time.
Yeah. Can I switch seats with Erika?
One word.
Void.
Void.
Complicated.
All right, go in the reverse order this
Nice.
time. What concept, scientific, ethical, or narrative, has shaped you the most?
Empathy.
Yeah, cybernetics.
Kindness?
Starting in the middle, and we're going to the left and then to the right. What frontier still scares you?
The deep ocean.
The second law of thermodynamics.
For those who eat crayons,
Do you know what entropy is, Mr. Murray?
thank you.
Okay.
Entropy, that should, what's his name, John Boyd.
Things
Good-
fall apart. The center
Yes.
cannot hold. That's the poetic.
John Boyd, the Boyd
definition,
cycle.
though.
Yes.
Yeah.
I wrote an essay for foreign policy about the use of the frontier frontier metaphor about space. I'm just going to pitch my essay instead.
Okay. What frontier still excites you?
Space. See, I can be positive.
Empathy.
What frontier still? The sky. That's so cheesy, but it's true.
No, there are no wrong answers. All right, you can answer in any order you want. If you could gift one idea to the next generation exploring space, what would it be?
Empathy. Let's keep using that word.
Right.
I don't think you're wrong.
Communication.
Take a couple history classes.
Ooh, just a
Try
few?
it. Just try
Just a
it.
few?
See what happens.
They gotta have some and then finally, per Fermi's paradox, are we alone?
No.
Yes, but only because of distance.
So you're saying we're alone within our own light cone? No, we're not alone.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm gonna let Frank do the official thank yous, but your instincts, your stories, your perspectives remind us that imagination is not just a luxury, it's a requirement and a tool. It helps us prepare, adapt, and build futures that reflect the best of who we want to be. Let's carry this in the conversations ahead. Frank, over to you.
Thank you, Che. Thank you, everybody. This was quite a conversation. Earlier this afternoon, we talked about how different fields contribute to norms development, but we didn't talk about communication. And I think it's clear based on this evening the importance of communication. At Meridian, we're bringing translators and interpreters here all the time. We do science diplomacy work, and that translation from STEM to the wider audiences is so important. And so I think as we think about our work on norms development again tomorrow, I think recognizing the important role of communication and communicators and the fact that you're going to be reaching much more folks than we are and how we can work together more is something we should be maybe analyzing a bit more deeply. But thank you all for doing this. Want to thank all of you as well. Want to thank our partners with the Plus Alliance for this evening. Also want to welcome, I understand that there is a State Department International Visitor Leadership Program group from New Zealand here, so welcome. This is Meridian is working on this professional exchange program, and it's a delegation here from New Zealand focusing on emerging tech and commercialization, and it includes representatives from the national government, academia, and the private sector. Just one more comment. Want to mention that we are hosting our 2026 Space Diplomacy Forum back here at Meridian on March 25th. It's going to be on the sidelines of the satellite conference, and we're really going to dig into different aspects of international space cooperation. We're going to be focusing on concepts like what happens to space cooperation post-ISS. What does international cooperation look like from a military perspective in the America First world? The dual use aspects, what does that mean in terms of cooperation? And so we are working on developing more of these themes right now. If this is some area that you'd be interested in partnering with us on, please see me or some of my colleagues in the back. And with that, now to the fun part. We've all deserved a few drinks, some food. And so I want to welcome you back to Meridian House. And so you'll be able to walk out right through these doors over here, and just a very short walk back next door. We will have our reception. But thank you so much.